All right, I've already shown you the disclaimer in the beginning while the music played. You got the countdown. For those of you who may be easily triggered, you've jumped off by now. And if you haven't, you're now choosing to listen at your own risk. Now I'm going to show my standard disclaimers. And as those go by, I can prep you all for what's about to come. And I'm also going to show where I got the music from. Okay. I didn't know who Sessue Hayakawa was until late last year, early this year. And at the same time, Takao Ozawa's name, if I'm pronouncing those correct, came up on my feed. And in that short amount of time that I figured out who these two people were, something just didn't sit right with me. But it was a representation of the ways in which some people can come from the exact same background, and one gets a kind of cult status treatment, and the other one, who's chosen to live a regular, clean, respectable life because they have no connections, are just pushed to the wayside. Now, before I go into this, let me say this. Takao sued in court after 20 years to be a United States citizen. Don't worry, I know that he's not the only non-white person nor non-black person at that time who sued the U.S. or petitioned for citizenship through the courts. So let's not make the assumption that I think that Takao Ozawa was the only male of Asian, particularly of Asian heritage, who had done the same. Okay? There were some in the mid to late 18th century, just like before his time. And then, of course, we all know about Dred Scott. And that may be a separate video, but I make no promises at this time. It may come before or after this one. Okay. So do know that I know about the guy who I think is Sikh or Indian, and he served in the United States Armed Forces at around the same time, and he wasn't getting citizenship. Then also another guy that of Japanese heritage who ran into the same issue. There were several at this time. The significance is in the argument that Takao Ozawa made, which we'll get into in a little while in this video. Okay. I prepared this observation of society's ability to select people when it is convenient to them. Again, while one person's on a pedestal, the other one isn't. I'm sure that most of my audience, my regular subscribers, may not be aware of who these people are. And if you are, feel free to give me some insight. And everyone that's listening, feel free to give some reasonable and realistic critiques. Because while I conducted my research, I could have missed some things. Before I go deep into this, understand that I'm speaking of a culture that isn't my own. Having a half Japanese husband doesn't mean I know everything about being Japanese, and I don't make the claim to. Understand that this is an observation. Some of the wording in terms of the time may offend some, and I think I've already covered that in the disclaimer. But as a person who myself studied history up to a master's level, I understand that things are kept within the context of their time, but at the same time, hindsight's 20/20, and lots of things that happened bad in the past cycle back around. Throat's a little dry. Understand that I decided also to focus on Japanese nationals who had come to America. And the reason being is, as I had stated before, Japan, unlike the rest of Asia and the Pacific Islands, at this time in the world was the only non-white imperial power. that may have played into the role as to why the Japanese may have had a different treatment in some variations than, say, the Chinese or Filipinos who arrived to the United States. But again, it ebbed and flowed, right? Different people got different types of treatment. My last disclaimer before I move on and get on to the subsequent slides, I took as detailed a notes as possible, so you're going to hear pages turn. All right, let's get into it. These are the two men in question, both Japanese nationals who arrived in America post-slavery. One of these men went on to Hollywood and was celebrated as a sex symbol. This is before the modern times where they went after Asian men as less than attractive, and trust and believe we're going to touch on that when I make another video of the comparison of stereotypes between Asian males in the modern day versus this time, and black men as well, and vaudeville and the minstrel. So that's going to come up later. The other male in the picture, on this slide, lived in the United States and had, by all appearances, a normal life. The further showed up to better himself after some setbacks. The latter adopted the American way of life, but was rejected from that very way of life he sought to have. I'm guessing this is a surface level explanation, but there's going to be more to this. Pardon the silence. What I'm getting at is, after being very confused and initially doing a little bit of rudimentary research on these guys, I'm going to get at 3 points that explain, in my opinion, why I think they were treated and accorded different treatment. So first, let's do some quick biographies of them. Born Kotaro Hayakawa in Japan in 1886, who would later become Sessue in Hollywood, comes from an affluent family. During his childhood, he dreamt of going to the United States, but his family planned for him to enter the Japanese Imperial Army. He obeyed, of course, and during an exercise on base when he was young, during a dive, he ruptured an eardrum, ending his hopes of being in the military, the hopes that his father had for him. His father felt that his actions were an embarrassment to the family, and as a result, young Kentaro nearly unalived himself, in the Japanese form of unaliving, when it is felt as if you have disgraced the family, but his father bust into the room in time to prevent him from doing so. He would eventually leave Japan for education in the United States. However, there are varying accounts as to whether he actually obtained a degree from the University of Chicago or if he ever attended that particular institution at all. Some accounts of his activities while in college are now thought to be exaggerated. After his education, he traveled back to the West Coast to await a ship to return home, but found a local theater instead. Suru Aoki, an actress, introduces him to a connection in Hollywood, and his career takes off. He would transition from silent films to talkies before anti-Japanese sentiment set in and derailed his career until post-World War II. For Takao Ozawa, I couldn't find much information on his life and his biography and how he grew up in Japan. I know little of his background, but I know he had come here between the age of 18 and 19 years old. He was here for 20 years before October 16, 1914, when he applied for U.S. citizenship. He held down a job for an American employer, learning to speak fluent English as well as deciding to practice Christianity. I'm going to go back to Sessue since we know a little bit more about him. So let's discuss the reason for his fame. So the matinee doll, you can read on screen the screens, but in addition to this, I'm gonna give a very blank definition. It was a creation of old Hollywood at its inception, of men of exceptional good looks that could woo a woman. This archetype included white males, with Sessue being the exception. For the most part, they were white males who looked a certain way, who dressed in suits, who looked like the Casanova types. And so, Sessue being an exception to that rule, he had the suits, he had the debonair looks, he had the slick back hair, but he was a Japanese national. In time, although he would go on to build a career, between 1918 and 1922, he forms his own company called Haworth Pictures Corporation. In addition to his sex symbol status in Hollywood, this was a remarkable thing for him to do at the time, for starters, because he didn't fit the white male identity, and as a Japanese national, he made a remarkable move to make his own films between those years of 1918 and 1922. His most significant fact for the time is that Sessue would have white leading ladies when this was viewed as obscene in most cases. That means it was widely believed that white women should marry white men and procreate with white men. Yet he was allowed to do so. I still don't have an explanation for that. So, yeah. Let's quickly move on. I'm going to do a quick analysis of Suru Aoki. Sorry, I know how to pronounce her name. I'm just flubbing my words. Sessue met Suro during his little Tokyo days in California. This is likely before he took the name Sessue, which I think means snowy planet or snowy continent. Again, someone who actually studies Japanese history or is Japanese can tell me what Sessue really means, because I forgot. But it has a connotation of something to do with snow. Remember, when she met him, he was waiting for a ship to come in to go home. She was born in Tokyo in 1892 and left Japan in 1899 with an uncle when she was about 6 or 7 years old. Her uncle was a traveling actor with a troupe that also served tea to patrons. When the troupe fell into financial troubles, his niece Suro was taken in by Toshio Aoki, a sketch artist. She'd gone on to theater, where she was discovered by a producer. I think his name was Thomas Ince, I-N-C-E, the same producer that assisted her future spouse in his career. After marrying Sessue and taking care of his son, now this son is with a white actress that he never married, a white American actress, and their 2 adopted daughters, she would go on to predecease him in 1961. Okay, so what are our, that's our comparisons here, right? These men were a lot more similar than we like to believe, and the comparisons are about to pop up. So there's no denying that these two had similar fates as young boys, having a desire to come to the United States and having a desire to have a different path in this country. Slide number 9, I don't go much into this slide, okay? But the Naturalization Act of 1906, it was signed into law by President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, of course. It made learning and speaking English fluently mandatory. The law stated that being a white person refers to the Caucasian race, and that a person of Japanese heritage, despite having white features, could not declare themselves to be white. Although it doesn't address the actual Japanese, that's going to be the outcome. So I want you all to keep that in mind, okay? Basically, there was a build up to all of this and a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. So the thing about this is, between that time, things were getting bad while Sessue was seeing all of this success in Hollywood. The average Japanese business owner or person who worked for another company suffered setbacks due to their Japanese heritage, or they could reasonably believe that, or reasonably accept that there could be discrimination based on that. Okay. So let's get into the 3 reasons I believe that the men are different. So the first reason, okay, Takao, having lived in the United States for 20 years, fought for the right to be an American citizen. Yet Sessue, despite having success in Hollywood, in my research I couldn't find it, but if you all can, guys and gals, let me know. I could find no evidence that Sessue was ever trying to sue or actively pursue United States citizenship. Again, we know October of 1914 that Takao Ozawa, who by then was living in Hawaii, had actually applied and was turned down. Actually, Ozawa wasn't challenging the idea that citizenship applied to white people and African nativity, because those are the only 2 people who were given automatic citizenship from, I think, the bill in 1870 was met by white, by Bloomberg standards, is the Caucasian race, anybody of white heritage. African nativity is what we call today foundational Black Americans, the descendants of slaves. That's when they were grandfathered in to automatically being citizens. Ozawa's argument is that since his skin was pale and he looked close to white, he should be classified as white. However, the courts at the end of 1922, I would say shortly before Christmas is when this came down, but somebody can correct me. The courts concluded that Japanese people cannot be classified as free white persons. Here's the thing, right? When you look at the images that are about to come on the screen, and I'll leave these up just a little bit, but not a lot. Based on what I have researched, Japanese brides seem to have been, or Japanese nationals coming as brides, seem to be weaponized as a threat, because their showing up was a confirmation that Japanese people were trying to put down permanent roots in the United States. See, the thing about the Japanese and any other group that had come over post Mayflower, I would say, or post slavery period, is that particularly if you were not Black or born here, or you were not free white person born here, you were very hard to categorize. And so because you were a new group and the nativist attitudes didn't want to compete economically, these women, I believe, had become a serious threat, and a threat that some people felt needed to be neutralized by not giving citizenship, if that makes sense. And if you read some of the captions, or a lot of these captions, it is offensive, but it's important to put yourself in that mindset, okay? Because this would eventually set the outcome for both of these gentlemen leading up to World War II. The second point I need to make, okay, is proximity. Okay. From the onset, Sessue had a seemingly great destiny. His father's affluence likely paid for his education in the United States before he almost returned home. Due to his family's social standing, he likely had something to return to in Japan while waiting for the ship. He so happened to discover Little Tokyo Theater, probably likely just something to pass the time, and changed his entire destiny. This is not without controversy. There were mixed reviews in Japan when they saw the film concerning his portrayal in the American media. And see, the thing is, Sessue had the Hollywood connections based on his wife, the connections that Takao could not say he had. Takao, actually wanting to stay, went to court and fought it. And again, I'm going to try to post a link to let you get a basic reading of the law and what it said about Takao Ozawa. So that's the thing. Sessue had a little bit of a different movement than him, and the images here show how differently the men were treated in the media. Don't get me wrong. In one of the advertisements, you can see how Sessue sometimes played a Japanese character, sometimes he played a Chinese character, and in one of these particular ones, he was now becoming a Hawaiian. And in this one advertisement where they call him an imp, understand that the meaning of imp, when translated in certain cultures, translates to demon. And you need to understand what that connotation means in the West. So Sessue on screen played the role that American society at that time went by and needed him to play. And he built a cult following off of that role. Whereas Takao embodied what it meant to be an American. He just didn't come from what they call the desirable background or the right skin color. And the nativist attitudes slowed him down. If that makes sense. Now we'll get to the final one that segues from the second one, which is racial classification. And again, I've made 2 videos about blooming box, so you must watch those to understand. And this is the basic classification. Those videos break it down. I know some people are not going to agree, in part because race can be a very divisive thing to talk about. When you see the newspaper articles, those newspaper articles make it clear who is wanted in the United States and who isn't. And the slide before this one made it clear that a so-called quote-unquote yellow man could never be a citizen. Why? Because Bloomberg, those racial categories were more than just theory. They were actually put to practice in Western societies. Who's going to rise and who isn't? And again, Sessue not wanting citizenship was not a threat, but Takao was, because he didn't insist on just living in the United States. He insisted on being treated as an American citizen. So I invite you all to go look them up. If you watch the playback, give some feedback. I'm sure this isn't going to sit well with a lot of people. It's just when I researched this, I noticed an observation. And it's just proof of our selection of who we choose to put on a pedestal and who we choose to treat inhuman. Sessue would pay a price as anti-Japanese sentiment continued. He would have to leave Hollywood. And I think him and Suro left in quiet and lived in quiet contemplation until she passed on, and he'd come back later on. But I think he made a comeback before Suro passed on. But in the end, Sessue also suffered. I can't find much about what happened to Takao Ozawa once the Supreme Court, I think it was, ruled against him, saying that he was not a free white person of color despite having light skin. All right, y'all tell me what y'all think. I know that this presentation wasn't that long, but I hope you got something out of it. Go do some research, and if you feel free to challenge me, do so. And again, if the images bothered you, I apologize, but history is taken within the context of its time. This is just my observation, and I know plenty of people will challenge it. All right, thank you all so much for watching, and have a good one.